Last night, my daughter-in-law spat in my face, and I simply wiped it dry and hit record. Today, as she toasts to her devoted care, she thinks I am just a senile old woman easy to manipulate. She has no idea that every insult and forged signature has been documented. With a single tap on my phone screen, I am about to turn her perfect little victory into a prison sentence. My name is Eleanor Whitfield, and at 62 years old, I have learned that patience is not just a virtue, but a devastating weapon. I sat at the head of the solid walnut dining table in my home in Brookfall, Ohio, projecting the image of the frail matriarch everyone expected to see. My left ankle was wrapped in a thick elastic bandage, and a fresh bruise blossomed like a dark violet on my wrist, peeking out just slightly from the sleeve of my oversized beige cardigan. To the guests filling my dining room, the sweater made me look weak and perpetually cold. They did not know that beneath the thick wool, concealed against my ribs, was a small digital recorder that had been running for 30 minutes. Nor did they know that the phone in my pocket was already paired via Bluetooth to the large flat-screen television mounted on the wall directly behind my daughter-in-law. The Sunday brunch was in full swing, and the air in the dining room was heavy with the scent of roasted quiche and expensive coffee. The room was crowded with familiar faces, including my neighbours from down the street and a few board members from the Hearthline Community Trust, where I had spent decades serving as director. Scattered among them were strangers introduced as friends of my daughter-in-law. I watched them over the rim of my cup with a passive expression. I had spent the last few weeks paying a private investigator to learn their names, and I knew they were not friends at all. They were sharks in cheap suits, waiting for the water to fill with blood. My son, Daniel Whitfield, hovered at my elbow. He was over 30 years old, yet he looked like a nervous child as he poured water into my glass with trembling hands. He asked if I was comfortable, his voice dripping with a performance of filial concern. I looked at him and felt nothing but a cold, hollow space where my love used to be. It was hard to believe this was the same man who, less than 12 hours ago, had stood in my kitchen and watched in silence while his wife assaulted me. He had not raised a hand to stop her. He had not spoken a single word of defense. Then there was Kayla Hart. She moved through the room with the efficiency of the registered nurse she claimed to be, her floral dress crisp and her smile practiced. She touched shoulders and laughed at jokes, playing the role of the saintly daughter-in-law caring for a difficult burden. She radiated confidence. In her mind, today was her victory lap. She believed she had finally broken me. She had reason to be confident. Last night, she had cornered me between the refrigerator and the sink. She had leaned in close, her eyes full of malice, and she had spat a mouthful of saliva and red wine directly into my face. It had dripped down my cheek, warm and humiliating. I had not screamed. I had not slapped her. I had simply taken a paper towel, wiped my skin dry, and walked to my room to lock the door. She took my silence for submission. She was wrong. I ran my hand along the edge of the table. My late husband and I had bought this wood, just as we had laid the marble in the kitchen with our own earnings. Every inch of this house was built on our sweat and love. Now, Kayla was using it as a stage to declare me incompetent and seize everything we had built. She thought I was a prop in her play, a senile old woman ready to be signed away into a care facility. I shifted my weight, feeling the hard leather of the briefcase tucked beneath my chair. It contained 2 months of meticulous work. It held bank statements, printed emails, and transcripts of conversations they thought were private. I checked the time. The special guests I had invited were due to arrive in exactly 5 minutes. Kayla tapped her spoon against her champagne flute to gather attention. The room went quiet. She began to speak, her voice trembling with fake emotion as she told the room about my tragic decline, my memory loss, and my unstable temper. She called me confused. She called me dangerous to myself. As she drew breath for her next lie, I took a slow sip of my coffee. With my other hand, I found the button on my phone screen and pressed it. The television behind her roared to life. It did not play the family photo slideshow she had prepared. Instead, it froze on a high-definition frame of a video file, paused and ready to play. Kayla faltered, her smile twitching as she glanced back. She tried to laugh it off, but the fear was starting to bleed through her makeup. Before I let you see the rest of this brunch, before I press play and watch her world crumble, you need to understand how she made the fatal mistake of underestimating me. You need to see how this began. 4 years ago, my life was defined by purpose and stability. I was the executive director of the Hearthline Community Trust, an organization dedicated to supporting impoverished seniors across the Midwest. My husband Frank and I had lived in our Brookfall home for nearly 30 years, building a life that felt unshakable. That illusion shattered on a grey Tuesday afternoon in February. Frank suffered a massive stroke while driving up our driveway. By the time I reached the car door, he was already gone. The silence that filled the house in the weeks following his death was heavy and suffocating. The rooms felt too large, and the quiet was not peaceful, but predatory. My son Daniel was living in the fictional city of Caldwin at the time, attempting to build a career in real estate. I loved my son, but I had spent years enabling his mediocrity. I had quietly paid off his maxed-out credit cards and covered his failed investments without ever telling Frank, desperate to protect the image of our successful family. When Daniel came home for the funeral, he brought Kayla. She was a nurse at a facility called Everholm Residences, or at least that is what she told me. She was modest, soft-spoken, and radiated a kind of professional warmth that I was desperate for. She knew exactly when to hand me a tissue and when to leave me alone. I remember clearly the first time she made tea for me in my own kitchen. She set the porcelain mug down on the table and sat across from me, her eyes full of concern. She asked me about growing old without Frank. She asked if I was afraid of being alone in such a big house at night. She asked if I worried about my memory slipping as the years went on. At the time, I thought she was an angel offering empathy. I poured my heart out to her, confessing my deepest insecurities. I did not realize that she was not listening as a friend, but as a predator scanning for weak points in the fence. She was cataloguing my fears so she could use them against me later. They were married 3 months later in a ceremony that felt surprisingly rushed. I felt a twinge of unease at the speed of it all, but I pushed it down, telling myself I was just being a cynical old woman. I was relieved that Daniel finally had someone steady in his life. A few months after the wedding, and barely 6 months after Frank died, they suggested moving in with me. They framed it as a temporary arrangement to help me manage the estate and cope with the grief. I was terrified of the loneliness that awaited me in the winter, so I agreed. The first few months of our cohabitation were deceptive. Kayla was perfect. She cooked nutritious meals, organized my medication, and even offered to help file the paperwork for the Hearthline Trust. She claimed she admired my work and wanted to learn. I felt incredibly blessed. I told my friends at the country club that I had won the lottery with my daughter-in-law. There were small things that should have warned me, like the way she lingered when the mail arrived, or how Daniel asked too many questions about the deed to the house. But I was too busy being grateful to notice. I often think back to one specific evening in the kitchen. Kayla was leaning against the marble counter, laughing at a joke, her face bright and beautiful. Daniel was sitting at the table with his feet propped up, drinking a beer and looking relaxed. I was standing at the sink, washing the dinner dishes, looking at them with a heart full of relief. I thought we had survived the tragedy. I thought we were a family again. I did not know that while I was scrubbing their plates. They were looking at my back and calculating exactly how long they would have to wait for me to die. It started with what Daniel called a sure thing. He came to me one evening with a glossy folder and a desperate shine in his eyes, talking about a commercial real estate flip in the city that could not fail. He needed $40,000 to secure his position as a partner. I hesitated, but Kayla was standing right beside him, her hand resting gently on my shoulder. She looked at me with those wide, sincere eyes and told me that this was the moment Daniel would finally step up, that this was a chance for Frank's legacy to truly grow. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to believe my son was capable of success. So I wrote the check. I told myself it was a one-time help to get him on his feet. I was wrong. Barely 3 weeks later, Kayla came to me in tears. She claimed her mother in Wisconsin needed emergency spinal surgery that insurance refused to cover. She needed $20,000 immediately, or her mother might never walk again. I transferred the money that same afternoon without asking for a single invoice or medical report. It felt cruel to demand proof of suffering from family. That was how they trained me to open my wallet on command. Over the next 6 months, the loans and emergency requests piled up until they had drained over $150,000 from my savings. Worse than the cash. I gave Daniel access to my primary investment accounts because he claimed it would be easier for him to track the market for me. Looking back, handing over those passwords was the single stupidest decision of my life. The atmosphere in the house began to shift. I noticed that I rarely saw my own mail anymore. The bank statements and investment reports that used to arrive in the middle of the month simply vanished whenever I asked. Kayla would say she had already brought the mail in and it was just junk flyers and catalogues. She was always the first one to the mailbox, acting like an efficient gatekeeper. One early morning, I woke up before dawn to get a glass of water and heard a voice coming from the back porch. It was Kayla on the phone. She was speaking low, but the morning air carried her voice clearly. She told the person on the other end that I was still lucid but easily obsessed with the idea of charity. She laughed and said to just let me think I was doing good. A cold chill went down my spine. I stood frozen in the kitchen, trying to process what I had heard. I desperately wanted to believe she was talking about a patient from her past job, so I forced myself to go back to bed and forget it. Soon, they began a coordinated campaign against my mind. If I misplaced my reading glasses, Daniel would make a show of searching for them, exchanging worried glances with his wife. If I repeated a story I had told the week before, Kayla would gently interrupt and say that I had just said that 5 minutes ago. They began to plant seeds of doubt in my own head. I heard them talking to the neighbors in hushed tones in the driveway, mentioning that they were worried about my memory and how I was becoming increasingly confused. Then came the paperwork. Kayla approached me one evening with a stack of documents for the Hearthline Trust. She suggested that she should be added as a signatory to help manage the administrative burden, framing it as a way to let me rest. She placed a pen in my hand and pointed to the signature line. I almost signed it, but years of administrative work made me pause. I read the fine print. Buried in a dense paragraph was a clause that would grant her the power to liquidate and transfer assets without board approval in the event of a medical emergency. I stopped. I told her I needed to read it over in the morning. The flash of irritation in her eyes was instant and terrifying. The final blow came 2 nights later. I was walking down the hallway and heard voices in the master bedroom. The door was cracked open. Daniel and Kayla were discussing their finances, but the tone was not one of worry. It was predatory. I heard Daniel ask how long they had to wait. Kayla replied that if the old woman got a diagnosis of dementia, they could file for guardianship immediately. She said that once they had guardianship, the house, the accounts, and everything else would belong to them. She did not call me Mom. She did not call me Eleanor. She called me the old woman. I stood in the dark hallway, my hand trembling against the wall, and realized with clarity that the family I thought I was supporting did not exist. To them, I was just an expiring asset that needed to be processed. I told Daniel and Kayla that I had an appointment with a heart specialist in Caldwin to check on my blood pressure. It was the first time I had lied to them with such ease. In reality, I drove straight to the law offices of Marjorie Blake. Marjorie was a widow like me and had been the legal counsel for the Hearthline Trust for over a decade. She was sharp, cynical, and the only person left in the world I knew I could trust completely. When I walked into her office and closed the door, I did not cry. I simply asked her to pull every single financial record attached to my name. What we found made the blood drain from my face. Marjorie projected the bank statements onto her screen, highlighting lines in red. Beyond the loans I had knowingly given Daniel, there was a hemorrhage of smaller, unauthorized transactions. $2,000 sent to an account linked to Everholm Residences. $1,500 wired to a company called Silvergate Care Solutions, month after month. These amounts added up to a staggering figure. Marjorie discovered that my electronic signature had been used to authorize a consulting agreement with Silvergate, granting them permission to manage my personal assets. I stared at the digital signature on the screen. It was a perfect replica of my own, likely authorized by Daniel using the passwords I had foolishly given him. Marjorie leaned across her desk and told me to stay calm. She advised me not to confront them yet. If I screamed now, they would cover their tracks or accelerate their plan to have me declared incompetent. We immediately filed paperwork to revoke any existing power of attorney Daniel held, but we did so quietly, ensuring the notifications would come to Marjorie's office, not my home. She then handed me a business card for a man named Owen Pierce. Owen was a former inspector for the Financial Crimes Division who now worked as a private investigator. I hired Owen that same afternoon. He was a man of few words who worked with terrifying efficiency. Within 3 days, he handed me a preliminary dossier that turned my stomach. He had followed Kayla not to a hospital or a clinic, but to a dilapidated building in an industrial park on the outskirts of the city. This was the registered headquarters of Silvergate Care Solutions. Owen described it as a boiler room operation where young people sat at folding tables, cold-calling seniors to sell them fake health investment packages. Kayla was not just a nurse. She was a recruiter for a predator. The dossier contained an even darker revelation. Owen had dug into Kayla's past and found that her nursing license in a neighboring state had been suspended 4 years ago. She had been investigated for coaxing hospice patients into signing complex insurance policies just days before they died. The investigation had stalled due to a lack of concrete evidence, and she had moved to Ohio, slightly altering the spelling of her last name to evade background checks. She was not a clumsy gold digger. She was a professional parasite who had done this before. I drove home that evening with the dossier hidden beneath the spare tire in my trunk. I sat alone in the living room as the sun went down, staring at a framed photograph of Frank on the mantel. I could hear his voice in my head, repeating the warning he gave me when he first started his business. He had told me never to let anyone else touch my books. I had broken that one sacred rule, and now I was paying the price. I felt a wave of shame so deep it nearly crushed me, but I forced that shame to harden into anger. Marjorie had given me a small, high-quality voice recorder before I left her office. I took it out of my purse and held it in my palm. It was smaller than a matchbox. I slid the switch to the side and watched the tiny red light blink once. I whispered a test phrase into the microphone and played it back. The audio was crystal clear. I deleted the file and smiled a cold, bitter smile. From this moment on, nothing in this house would be a secret. Every lie they told, every threat they whispered, and every plan they made would be captured. I was done being the victim. I was the witness for the prosecution. I began to play the role they had written for me with cold calculation. During dinner with Kayla and two of her friends, I deliberately asked the same question about the weather 3 times in the span of 10 minutes. I watched the satisfaction settle in Kayla's eyes as she exchanged knowing glances with her guests. Later that week, I staged small accidents throughout the house. I placed the salt shaker inside the refrigerator next to the milk and left my reading glasses inside the china cabinet. I made sure to record the aftermath as Kayla sighed theatrically and told Daniel that his mother was fading faster than they expected. It was humiliating to act the fool in my own home, but I needed them to feel overconfident. While I distracted them with my feigned decline, Owen went to work. On a Tuesday afternoon, when Daniel and Kayla were out meeting with their real estate friends, Owen installed high-definition pinhole cameras in the foyer, the upper corner of the dining room, and the garage. The devices were invisible to the naked eye and uploaded footage directly to a secure cloud server that only Marjorie and I could access. The investment paid off almost immediately. 2 nights later, I sat in my bedroom with headphones on, reviewing the day's footage. I watched a video from the garage camera showing Kayla pacing back and forth, talking on her cell phone to a man she addressed as Victor. Owen identified him as Victor Hale, the operator of the Silvergate scheme. The audio was crisp. I heard Kayla say that they needed to push the guardianship papers through quickly because she was worried I might wake up one day and change my will. She told him to have the paperwork ready to file by Monday. The next step in their plan arrived in the mail. It was a letter inviting me for a cognitive assessment with a neurologist that Kayla claimed was the best in the state. In reality, Owen's background check showed that this doctor had received multiple consulting payments from Silvergate and had a pattern of diagnosing wealthy seniors with incapacity just before their assets were transferred. I pretended to be grateful for the appointment. I went to the clinic with my digital recorder taped to the inside of my blouse. During the exam, I answered every question with absolute precision. I recited the date, the current president, and performed complex subtraction in my head. I saw the doctor glance nervously at Kayla, who was standing in the corner signaling him to find a fault. The smoking gun came after the exam. I was changing back into my clothes and left the door slightly ajar. The recorder picked up Kayla whispering to the doctor in the hallway. She told him that he just needed to put down mild cognitive impairment on the official form and that they would handle the rest from there. She promised him it would be worth his time. Just as I thought I had enough evidence, a final piece of the puzzle fell into my lap. A woman named Monica, a former nursing colleague of Kayla, managed to contact me through a private message on social media. She was terrified, but said she could not sleep knowing Kayla was at it again. She revealed that years ago, Kayla had brainwashed a lonely elderly man into signing over his life savings to a fake charity linked to Silvergate just weeks before he died. I met Monica in a secluded coffee shop 3 towns away to ensure we were not seen. She was shaking, but I took her hand and asked her if she was willing to be a witness when the time came. She agreed. As I drove home, the final shape of my revenge took form. If Kayla wanted to stage a public spectacle to prove I was incompetent, I would let her. I would let her believe she had won completely, right up until the moment I brought the entire stage crashing down on her head. The following week, Daniel came home with a thick stack of papers. He laid them on the coffee table, avoiding my eyes, and told me it was just a standard procedure to protect my assets in case something happened to my health. It was the guardianship application. Kayla stood behind him, her hands on my shoulders, massaging my tense muscles with a touch that felt like a snake coiling. She spoke in a soft, soothing voice, telling me that signing this would take the burden off my shoulders. I feigned confusion. I asked innocent questions about the clauses, stumbling over the legal jargon to make them feel secure in their superiority. I told them I needed to think about it until after the brunch they had planned for Sunday. I wanted to give them hope so the crash would be harder. The night before the brunch, the tension in the house was palpable. I decided to test the waters one last time. I found Kayla in the kitchen and asked her simply if, once the papers were signed, we would keep the house. I watched her mask slip. She snapped that the house was too big and expensive, and that selling it and splitting the proceeds was the only logical move. Later that night, I went to the kitchen for a glass of water. Kayla was there, finishing a bottle of wine. She was drunk on confidence and Merlot. When I walked in, she didn't smile. She cornered me between the sink and the refrigerator. Her face was twisted with a rage I had never seen before. She told me that I had lived too long and consumed too much. She told me I was selfish for holding on to money I didn't need. When I stood there, silent and stoic, refusing to give her the reaction she wanted, she lost control. She leaned forward and spat a mouthful of wine and saliva directly into my face. The warm liquid ran down my cheek. The smell of alcohol was pungent. I looked at her, and then past her, to the doorway where Daniel stood watching. He saw everything. He saw his wife assault his mother, and he did nothing. He just looked down at the floor. That was the moment my heart finally broke, and then calcified into something harder than stone. I did not wipe the spit off immediately. I let it sit there for a moment, letting the humiliation burn itself into my memory. Then, slowly, I reached for a paper towel. I wiped my face dry, threw the towel in the trash, and walked out of the room without saying a word. I went to my bedroom, locked the door, and saved the recording I had just captured. I named the file Brunch. I laid in bed, staring at the ceiling, and for the first time in months, I slept soundly. I knew that tomorrow, I wouldn't just be serving quiche, I would be serving justice. The morning of the brunch arrived with a deceptive stillness. I woke up long before the rest of the house stirred, my mind sharp and clear. In the privacy of my locked bedroom, I opened the briefcase one last time to review the arsenal I had assembled. The papers were organized in neat stacks. I touched the cold edges of the bank statements, showing the unauthorized withdrawals. the consulting contracts with Silvergate Care Solutions, and the printed emails between my daughter-in-law and Victor Hale. I read over the sworn statement from Monica and the preliminary report from Owen, my private investigator. Everything was there. It was a mountain of evidence built on their greed. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. It was Marjorie, calling early as promised. Her voice was tight with anticipation. She informed me that she had successfully reached a contact within the State Attorney General's office who had been building a case against Silvergate for months. They were treating this as a priority investigation into elder fraud. She told me that 2 special investigators would be attending the brunch today, posing as old friends of hers from the city. They were coming not just to observe, but to execute a warrant if the evidence held up. I thanked her and hung up, feeling a surge of adrenaline that chased away the ache in my joints. I had made one additional invitation myself, a wild card that Kayla would never expect. I had reached out to a woman named Lorna Graves. Lorna was the sister of an elderly man who had died under suspicious circumstances while in Kayla's care in her previous state. Lorna had always suspected foul play, but lacked the proof to go to the police. Today, she would finally get the closure she deserved. By 8 in the morning, the house was bustling. Kayla and Daniel were frantic in the kitchen, arranging platters of pastries and fruit. I decided to commit fully to my role. I sat in an old wheelchair we had kept in the closet since Frank's surgery years ago. I did not need it to move, but I needed it to complete the image of the helpless invalid. Kayla wheeled me into the dining room, positioning me at the head of the table like a doll. She patted my shoulder and adjusted my cardigan, unaware that her touch made my skin crawl. The guests began to arrive shortly after 9, the room filled with neighbours, a few board members from the Hearthline Trust, and a collection of Daniel's associates. These men were real estate brokers and developers who looked at my home and saw only square footage and dollar signs. Kayla was in her element, floating between groups with a champagne flute in hand. I heard her sigh loudly to Mrs. Higgins next door, whispering about how difficult the week had been because I had forgotten her name twice yesterday. Mrs. Higgins looked at me with pity, and I offered a vacant smile in return. Then the doorbell rang, and Marjorie entered with 2 serious-looking men in suits. She introduced them as colleagues from her firm. Kayla greeted them with her practiced charm, shaking their hands firmly. I watched her eyes. She saw only more witnesses to her performance, completely missing the predatory intelligence in the way the investigators scanned the room. They were not here to eat quiche. They were here to hunt. 20 minutes later, the final guest arrived. Lorna Graves walked in wearing a simple grey dress, looking out of place among the pearls and blazers. When Kayla turned to greet her, I saw a flicker of genuine shock crack her mask. She recognized Lorna instantly, for a second. Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly, pretending they were strangers. Lorna introduced herself as someone who had a family member at Everholm Residences years ago. Kayla laughed nervously and said it was a small world. Across the room, Lorna's eyes met mine. I gave a barely perceptible nod. We were ready. While the guests mingled, I watched Daniel and Kayla retreat to the kitchen to refill the mimosa pitcher. I checked the feed on my phone hidden under the tablecloth. The camera Owen had installed on top of the refrigerator was recording perfectly. I watched as Kayla shoved Daniel's shoulder and hissed that he just needed to get me to sign the papers this afternoon, and then it would all be over. She had no idea that her confession was being stored in high definition on a server secure enough to stand up in federal court. I sat at the head of the table as everyone took their seats. The noise of chatter and silverware clinking filled the air. I looked around at the faces of the people who thought they knew me, and the two people who thought they owned me. For the first time in months, the knot of fear in my stomach was gone. I lifted my coffee cup, inhaled the rich aroma, and set it back down without taking a sip. I realized I did not need to worry about what was in the drink. They would not poison me today. They needed me alive to sign their papers, and they had no idea that their time had already run out. Once everyone had settled into their seats and the first round of mimosas had been poured, Kayla decided it was time to cement her narrative. She stood up, tapping her fork against her glass to silence the room. She looked beautiful and deeply concerned, the very picture of a martyr devoting her life to family. She began to speak, her voice wavering with practiced emotion as she described the difficult journey of caring for a loved one in decline. She told the room that watching me fade away was the hardest thing she had ever done, painting herself as the only thing standing between me and total collapse. She launched into a series of anecdotes that were twisted versions of the truth. She told the guests that just last week, I had tried to wander out into the street in the middle of the night, confused and calling for my dead husband. In reality, I had simply stepped onto the back porch at 10 in the evening to listen to the cricket broadcast on the radio, fully aware of where I was. She claimed I no longer remembered how to use the microwave and had nearly caused a fire. The guests nodded in sympathy, clucking their tongues and casting pitying looks in my direction. I decided to help her dig the hole a little deeper. I looked up from my empty plate, blinked rapidly, and asked loudly if today was Tuesday. I looked at Daniel and asked him if we had already finished supper. A ripple of uncomfortable silence went through the room. Kayla smiled sadly at the guests, a look that said, "See, this is what I deal with every day," and squeezed my shoulder. She was practically glowing with victory. She thought she had successfully turned everyone in the room into a witness for her future court hearing. The man in the navy suit, one of the investigators Marjorie had brought, leaned forward. He kept his tone casual and asked Kayla if, given the severity of the situation, they had considered seeking legal guardianship. Kayla took the bait immediately. She nodded gravely and admitted that they were currently preparing the necessary paperwork to have Daniel appointed as my guardian for all financial and medical decisions. She said it was the only way to protect me from myself, since I was no longer capable of understanding complex matters. Daniel, eager to look like the responsible patriarch, jumped in to support her. He added that they had already taken over the management of the Hearthline Trust accounts to ensure everything remained stable. I saw Marjorie's eyebrows shoot up. Beside her, the two investigators were not eating. They were memorizing every word. Daniel had just admitted to accessing restricted charity funds without authorization in front of federal agents. Then Lorna spoke up. Her voice was soft, but carried across the table. She asked Kayla where she had worked before coming to Ohio. Kayla answered smoothly, naming a generic hospital system. Lorna smiled a tight, cold smile, and asked if she remembered a patient named Edgar Graves. For a fraction of a second, the colour drained from Kayla's face. Her eyes darted to Lorna, trying to place her. She recovered quickly, shaking her head and saying the name did not ring a bell, but I saw her hand tighten around the stem of her glass until her knuckles turned white. Owen, sitting quietly at the corner of the table, caught the reaction too. He glanced at me, his eyes signalling that the prey sensed the trap. I looked at my son. Daniel was smiling at the guests. but there was a sheen of sweat on his forehead. I could see the fear behind his eyes. He knew on some level that they were pushing too hard, that they had stepped over a line from which there was no return. He was not just greedy anymore. He was terrified. He was a man drowning who thought grabbing onto an anchor would save him. Kayla regained her composure and raised her glass. She asked everyone to join her in a prayer for my mental health and for the strength of the family to endure this trial. She placed her hand on my shoulder again, performing for her audience. I let the silence hang in the air for a long moment. Then I smiled, a genuine, sharp smile that did not reach my eyes. I nodded slowly and spoke clearly, dropping the tremor I had feigned for weeks. I told her that if we were talking about mental health and the truth, perhaps it was time I said a few words. I asked the room for a moment of their time. With a steady hand that betrayed none of the weakness I had feigned for months, I reached beneath my chair and pulled out the heavy leather briefcase. I placed it on the polished walnut table with a thud that made the silverware rattle. I looked around the table, meeting the confused eyes of my neighbors and the terrified gaze of my son. I told them clearly that I wanted them to hear the entire story, not just the sanitized version Kayla had just performed. I took the small digital recorder from my pocket and placed it in the center of the table, right next to the vase of fresh hydrangeas Kayla had arranged that morning. I pressed the play button. The audio was crisp and loud in the silent room. First came the sound of Kayla's voice, low and venomous, threatening me in the kitchen. Then came the unmistakable sound of spitting wet and visceral. The room heard my silence, followed by the rustle of a paper towel. Then, Kayla's voice cut through the air again, delivering the line that would seal her fate. She called me nothing but a breathing wallet. The effect was immediate. The color drained from Kayla's face, turning her complexion from a flush of victory to a sickly, ghostly white. Mrs. Higgins, my neighbor of 20 years, audibly gasped and instinctively pulled her chair back, putting distance between herself and my daughter-in-law as if Kayla were contagious. The silence that followed the recording was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. I did not give them time to recover. I pointed my phone at the television screen behind Kayla. The video I had paused earlier began to play. It showed the foyer of my house from a high angle. Everyone watched as Kayla opened the front door to a courier, accepted a thick manila envelope with the Silvergate logo, and shoved it deep into her purse. In the same motion, she took a letter from my bank, ripped it into pieces, and stuffed the confetti into her pocket. The evidence of mail theft and conspiracy was displayed in high definition. I reached into my briefcase and pulled out a stack of printed emails. I held one up and read it aloud to the room. It was dated 3 days ago, sent from Kayla to Victor Hale. I read the sentence where she assured him that once I signed the guardianship papers, Silvergate would have full access to the Hearthline accounts as agreed. As I finished reading, the 2 men in suits who had arrived with Marjorie stood up. They pulled badges from their jackets and identified themselves as special investigators from the Attorney General's office. They announced that they were actively investigating Silvergate Care Solutions for large-scale elder fraud. Before Kayla could stammer a denial, Lorna stood up. Her hands were shaking, but her voice was strong. She pulled a small, worn photograph from her purse and held it up for the guests to see. It was a picture of a frail man in a hospital bed. She told the room that this was her brother, Edgar. She recounted how Kayla had convinced him to transfer his life savings to a care fund that did not exist, and how he had died of a heart attack weeks later, destitute and heartbroken. Lorna began to sob, and the sound tore through the remaining tension in the room. Marjorie stepped forward then, laying out the financial facts with brutal efficiency. She presented a spreadsheet showing unauthorized transfers from my accounts to Silvergate, authorized by my son using passwords he had sworn to protect. Daniel looked at the papers, then at the investigators, and panic seized him. He started to stammer, pointing a trembling finger at his wife. He claimed he only did what Kayla told him to do because she said it was a sound investment. He tried to paint himself as a victim, but his voice was weak. I cut him off. I told him to save his breath. I informed the table that 3 weeks ago, I had visited a notary with Marjorie. I announced that I had executed a new will. I had removed Daniel as my primary beneficiary entirely. The bulk of my estate would go to the Hearthline Trust, with the remainder going to my niece, Amelia, who lived in Oregon and had never once asked me for a dime. Kayla lost control. She slammed her hands on the table and screamed that I was not lucid enough to sign a legal document. She yelled that any will I wrote was void because of my mental state. One of the investigators looked at her calmly and delivered the final blow. He asked her a simple question. If I was not lucid enough to sign a will, he asked, then why did the guardianship papers she prepared for me to sign today contain such complex financial clauses? Why would she ask a confused woman to authorize a multi-million-dollar transfer? Kayla opened her mouth to answer, but no sound came out. She froze, realizing she had just walked into a trap of her own making. With the walls closing in, Kayla dropped the facade completely. She spun toward Daniel, her finger jabbing into his chest, and screamed that this was all his idea. She claimed she was just a supportive wife who had been dragged into his financial mess because she loved him too much. She looked at the investigators with wide, frantic eyes and swore she was just a victim of her husband's greed. Daniel looked at her, stunned. He had always seen her as the mastermind, the captain of their ship, and now she was throwing him overboard to save herself. I watched them turn on each other, two wolves fighting over a scrap of meat. It was the first time Daniel had not instinctively jumped to her defense. I leaned forward and spoke directly to my son. I told him he could tell the truth right now, in this room, or he could save it for the judge and the prison cell awaiting him. He crumbled. He began to weep, a loud, ugly sound that echoed in the dining room. He confessed everything. He admitted he knew about the guardianship scheme. He admitted to signing papers he knew I did not understand. And then, looking at his shoes, he admitted that he had stood by and watched while Kayla spat in my face last night because he was too afraid to stop her. The investigators did not waste time. One of them produced a temporary search warrant that Marjorie had helped secure. They demanded Kayla's phone, her laptop, and the keys to the Silvergate office. Around the table, I saw faces pale. Two of the real estate brokers Daniel had invited looked at each other with dawn horror, realizing they had moved money into Silvergate too. This was not just a family spat. It was a crime scene. Kayla realized her life was over. With a guttural scream, she lunged across the table. She tried to snatch the recorder from my hand, screaming obscenities at me. Owen moved faster than a man his age should. He and the nearest investigator intercepted her, pinning her arms back before she could reach me. The guests gasped. The gentle, patient nurse was gone, replaced by a feral creature baring her teeth at an old woman. Lorna stepped into the space between us. She looked Kayla dead in the eye. She told her that she thought she could hide here, preying on another old woman. But the past has a way of catching up. She said her brother died believing in Kayla's lies, and she had waited 4 years to see this moment. For the first time, Kayla stopped struggling. She was not just angry anymore. She was terrified. The lead investigator delivered the final blow. He announced that Victor Hale had been arrested that morning on orders from the Attorney General. Victor had already started talking to cut a deal. He had named Kayla as a primary organizer and handed over a client list that included my name. The room went deadly quiet. Everyone understood that this was no longer a civil dispute. This was a federal case. They put Daniel in handcuffs right next to his wife. He tried to twist his body around to look at me. He begged me to listen. He promised to cooperate, to testify against everyone if I just forgave him. I looked at the boy I had raised. I told him that the moment he watched his wife spit on his mother and did nothing, he had cut the cord between us himself. I told him to save his apologies for the judge because I had none left to give. The police led them out the front door, past the stunned guests. The room was a wreck of half-eaten quiche and spilled champagne. Marjorie, Owen, Lorna, and I remained standing in the debris of the morning. I looked at the spot on the table where the recorder sat. I took a deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs without the weight of fear for the first time in months. I looked at my friends and asked simply if anyone wanted to stay and help me wash the dishes. The breakfast was over. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts on how you would have handled this situation. If you enjoyed this story, please make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary, hit that like button, and give us a hype to help share these stories with more people.